Okay, so why not TypeScript? The purpose of this video is to walk you guys through a story about how someone might build a component in React using TypeScript or just pure old JavaScript. So let's talk about some things that you need to think about when you're going to make a decision on whether or not you should use TypeScript or JavaScript to write your React applications. The first is it's different depending on the project. You might open up a different project even if it's at the same company, and the way that the types are defined might be different because maybe it has a different TypeScript config file, or maybe the developers just have different practices. In addition, you might be on a team that's using TypeScript in a project, but within that team, you have two developers that come from two different places, and in those different places, they have 3 years of experience writing TypeScript, you guessed it, slightly differently. So you need to understand that sometimes when you go and you research TypeScript and you look at examples online, you might see all sorts of different implementations on how to type something. There's simple ways of doing it, there's more complex ways of doing it. You can use more or less generics. All sorts of different permutations will exist out in the wild. Now, why would you use TypeScript over JavaScript? Well, you would use TypeScript over JavaScript if you like to have your types, you like the type safety, and you like to have that IntelliSense where it tells you, what are the different properties that are in this component. But there are also some shortcomings to using TypeScript. One of them is that sometimes the cognitive load can be more on the user. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes if you have a React component that's rendered on the screen and it's a very complex component, it has tons and tons of properties and lots of generics, then it might lead to a lot of thinking that the developer has to do when they open up that TypeScript file. So what I've done is I've come up with an example website, which I'll link in the description, to show off how you might build a component with TypeScript or with JavaScript. So let's take a look at this first one. This first one says, we would like to create a user component that shows the first name, last name, and date of birth. The first name and last name are strings, and the date is a JavaScript date object. So the key difference between these two things is that in one of them, we needed to define user props, and the other, we did not. So if I scroll down here, we can see that when we render the user object, it looks identical, right? But if we scroll down, we can see that in the JavaScript file, we did not need to define a type for the user's props, first name, last name, and date of birth. But in the TypeScript file, we needed to define an interface called user props, first name string, last name string, date of birth date, and we needed to define that the input here takes user props. Now, one thing to note is I have a little switch toggle at the top to show that there's actually different versions of this code that you can write. For example, in this version of TypeScript, we decided that we wanted to return or specify the return type that is a React node. If I switch the switch toggle from verbose to simple, we can see that we actually don't need that React node input or import, and we don't need to specify the return type of the user object. That can be what's called inferred. It's inferred, and newer versions of TypeScript code that you will see will do a lot more type inference. So now, before I dive in further, I just want to mention that if you're ever curious and want to understand what these React types mean, because there are different types, you can always come up here and click on this reminder, and it will remind you of the different things you might see in the React world. What is a React element? What is a JSX element? What is a React node? And what is this FC thing that you see all over the place? Okay? And in the examples going forward, you'll see that in my more verbose versions, I actually use the FC, which is the functional component type, in the verbose versions, because you might see that in the wild a lot. But then in the simple versions, I no longer use that. And you can go and link here to read about how they removed that from the React Starter application to no longer use that type, as it was unnecessary. So let's go ahead and go into our code again. So let's take a look at this. What do we have? We talked about the types, first name, last name, and date of birth. What else we have is a table with some table headings and some table data. We just have what is written with, TypeScript or JavaScript, the first name, the last name, and the date of birth. You can see that the JSX is actually identical in both the left and the right. The only difference is the properties up top, where we had to define user props. So knowing that, we can go and start building different versions of this to see how this evolves over time. And I want to note also that at the top of every file, it tells you how many line numbers are in that file and how many characters are in that file. Remember, every single one of these versions is going to render the exact same thing twice, once written in JavaScript and once written in TypeScript. However, there will be different number of lines and different number of characters because of the types. And it might lead to more confusion, or maybe you like that the types are there and it makes you more comfortable. And just note in the upper right corner, you can always toggle on to show the line numbers if you want to see them. So with that, let's go to version 2. So in version 2, we said, okay, so we had our component from before, but now we want to style every TD, the table data item, in our table. We could do this by adding class name td-class to every TD line item. But a better way to do this would be to create a reusable table data component and add the class to that element in the component. So if we scroll down here, we can see that in both examples, we have a new component called table data. The table data component takes children and renders them in a TD element. The element takes a class name td-class. So we don't have to put class name td-class multiple times. And you notice that we just go down below and we change the TD to be table data. Now, what's the difference between the left and the right? Well, on the right side of the screen, we can see we needed to define a new interface, table data props. And we needed to pass that interface as a generic to this FC component to say, okay, this table data accepts table data props, which takes children. And what does it return? It returns a JSX element. Again, if you forget what that is, you can come up to the reminder section and remind yourself what a JSX element is. Now, this again is the more verbose syntax you see more older TypeScript and specifically TSX files having, but the simpler approach would be to not use that FC component. And you can see as I toggle back and forth between the FC and not the FC component, you can see it's much simpler and you no longer have to define FC here. And you can just say, okay, I have a table data component that takes table data props. There's the children. This is the properties destructured. This is the type table data props. And we don't even need to specify a return type because it's type inferred. So you can see clearly the TypeScript file is growing. It's a little bit bigger. We already are up to 626 characters in the right file and 475 characters in the left file. But we're not even getting to a complex scenario yet. So with this, let's move on to our next example. In version 3, we want to add an add one button action that will increment a count column in our user. Note how we added the add one helper function outside the component. So if we scroll down here, we can see that we added some state. Let's first take a look at the left. The left has a use state here, and the use state returns a count and a set count. We have an increment function that will call our setter, our set count, our setter, and we'll take the previous count and we'll call our add one function. Now I could have done this in line, but I wanted to show how you could also define helper functions outside of your components and how you would type those. So we can see we added an add one up above that took a value property v and added 1 to it. There's no types in the left, we're in our JavaScript code. But on the right, we did the same thing, but we needed to type it. So let's first take a look at that add one function. The add one function takes a value v, but what type is that? Well, it's of type number. And it returns something. Well, we said that's type number, okay? Now, if I turn off the verbose, you can see that you can also write that such that the type inference of the return type is clear and you don't actually have to write it there. But I wanted to show what, again, you might see in the wild. So if we look at our state down below, you'll also note that you have a use state which takes a generic number to tell it that, oh, you know, this use state is going to be working on a value of type number. And we also, just to show off that sometimes you might see this in the wild as well, we have that this function returns void. But really that's unnecessary, and you can take a look at the simple version of this and just say, okay, look mom, no types. This is actually pure JavaScript, even though it's actually in a TypeScript file, because again, there can be some nice type inference done because you're passing a 0 here to know, oh, this is actually going to operate on a number, and we don't need to put void here. That's redundant. So you can see we've added some types to this. We didn't go overboard. We only really added that the add one takes a number here, and we added our new function and our new state on the left and the right. If we take a look, we have 916 characters in this user file, and we have 733 on the left JavaScript version. And we can see that when we click this add button, it works. we can add and increment that value. Okay, so now we're on version 3. Let's go take a look at version 4. So what does version 4 want to do? Well, previously, we always rendered a simple button that we hard-coded, right? But now we want the ability for the developer to pass in a custom button, okay? So let's go take a look at that code. If we scroll down, we can see that now in the first file here, we defined a blue button on the left and a red button on the right. You can see our user object now takes a button, blue button in this case, and red button in this case. And if we look at the code up above, we can see that we're rendering a blue and red button. Now on the left, we just have pure JavaScript. It's a button that takes an onClick and passes it to the native button's onClick with a color of blue. On the right, we can see the same thing. However, again, because we're using TypeScript, we need to define the button properties. Now, where are the button properties defined? They're not defined in the first file. They're actually defined in the second file. Why? Well, because what we wanted to do is make sure that whatever type is passed into the user had the correct properties on it, i.e. onClick, such that the onClick would work. So if we look here, we see that there's a button type now, and we say it's a component type, which takes button props, where button props has an onClick function, which is a mouse event handler, right? So we set all of that, and now we're able to actually go down here and render our button with our onClick, which is our increment function. If we look on the left, we can see we did the same thing. We rendered a button with an onClick increment, but we didn't have to define all of those types. Now, when we defined the button outside of the user component, in order to pass it in, we needed access to this button props interface. So what we did is we actually came up here and we imported button props from user. So we imported button props such that we could use it here. Now again, I want to note that this is the more verbose syntax. If I switch this toggle, you can see we will no longer use the FC and no longer put the return type here. So the code is slightly more simplified. But again, we still need the button props from that other file. So you can see if I scroll down here, we take another look at our lines and our characters. We have 726 characters in this file and 1020 characters in the TypeScript file. It will vary depending on if you're using the old or new syntax here. Okay, so we've shown that now this can accept a button. We can pass a button component in to our user component. What are we going to do next? Well, in version 5, we want to update that such that we allow the user to pass a button to the user component, but we want them to also be able to pass a thing. So what's a thing? Well, a thing can be anything. Button was slightly more unique because it was a component that needed to have button props. But in this case, we want to be able to pass any React component down to the user object to be rendered in the thing column. So if we look at our example here, we see that the number 2 is rendered in the thing column on the first one, and the string hello is rendered in the thing column on the second. If we take a look at our JavaScript first, we can see we're just passing thing equals 2. If we scroll down, again staying on the left side of the screen, we can say that our user function now takes thing and renders it as a new table data down below. Now let's take a look at the TypeScript on the right. So on the right, we needed to make sure that we, again, pass in our thing here, right, which is the string hello, but we need to update our user props to have thing. But what should thing be? Well, now we have to think about it, right, because we're in the TypeScript world. Well, because I decided that I didn't want to have some specific type that had like button props, such in the case of button, I wanted anything, I used React node instead. And if I go and I remind myself in the reminder here, what is a React node? It's a React element, a fragment, a string, a number, array of React nodes, all sorts of different things. So it's a very kind of generic-y type. I can pass whatever the heck I really want as long as it can be rendered in JSX. Again, if we were to toggle on the simple, we can see that this is the simplified version of the TypeScript. But again, we still needed to add the React node for the thing property here and render that thing down below here. Okay, so again, let's compare on this example. We built a slightly more complex thing. Let's take a look at the lines of code. In the simplified version for TypeScript, we're at 1086 characters and 69 lines. On the left side for the JavaScript, we're at 53 lines and 776 characters. So you can see slowly as we add more to this, the amount of characters is starting to run away from us. And why that's important to think about is sometimes there are developers that don't like the cognitive load of having to read all that extra stuff. So let's continue with version 6. All right, so what's different about version 6? Well, in version 6, we now want the user to be able to pass down two new props, color and disabled. The color is going to affect the color of some of the cells in the table, and the disabled is going to disable the button. All right, so let's go take a look at the code for this. So first we can see clearly that the color of the first cell is green, and the color for the button is green, and the buttons are disabled, right? If we go down to the bottom, we can see the reason for that is only on the first guy are we passing in the color to the table, first table data, and we're passing the color down to the button, and in addition, we're passing disabled down to the button, okay? So first, let's take a look at the JavaScript. In the JavaScript, our blue button component now takes two new props, color and disabled. We pass down the color to our style prop that we already had, and disabled, which is a button property. If we look down below, we can see that in the user object, we pass in color equals green and disabled, which is a Boolean value if you don't put the equals and curlies after it, okay? On the right, you can see it's the exact same thing, but rendered with our red button. And in this case, we needed to update our button props. But remember, our button props actually came from our user file. So we'll scroll down and we'll take a look at our user file. We have button props here, but we did something a little bit differently. Because we wanted to not have to, rewrite what a button, HTML native button can accept, we said, well, there's already a type for that. Turns out it's button HTML attributes, and that takes a generic button element, HTML button element. So what happens is we're going to build a new type instead of defining our own interface that combines our color property with the native button properties. So that's what we did here. So no longer do we need to specify like that an on-click native event. And we don't need to put that mouse handler or any of that stuff in here anymore. So with that, now that we've added our color to our button props, we also need to add color and disabled to our user props. Now note, in this case, we added something different that we haven't seen in this video so far, which is question mark next to disabled and color. That's because these are actually optional fields. If we take a look at the table data props also has an optional here because we optionally want to take in the color field. So we've updated table data props, we've updated our user props to take disabled and color, and we have a new definition of our button props. Again, if we go into the simplified version, we can see that we just aren't dealing with those FC components. You might see this in the wild as well. But we're still rendering or having to define our user props and our button props and our table data props, okay? And just like before, in the JavaScript code, we're passing our on-click, our disabled, and our color, so the JSX is actually identical. Now, if we take a look at the top here, and we look at the difference in the lines, again, keeping us on the simplified version of the TypeScript, for the first file, we have 24 lines on both, but we have a little bit more characters. And on the second one, we have 53 lines in the JavaScript versus 73 lines in the TypeScript, right? We have 857 characters versus 1,300 characters, 1,337 characters in the TypeScript. So you can see we don't even have that complicated or that complex of a user component, but over time, we're getting a lot of extra stuff in here, which again, sometimes is beneficial, but I just want everyone to be aware that this does happen over time in type files. Okay, so now let's go look at our last example, version 7. In this example, we show you how you can use an interface in multiple places and in multiple ways. If we scroll down, we'll see that we have a new, we have the same column, thing, but we have numbers rendered in both. Now remember, before, thing accepted a string, hello, and a number, the number 2. Well, we've now updated that. Let's first look at the JavaScript, okay? So now, our thing takes a sum component that renders an A and a B summed together. So 24 plus 4 should equal 28. If we scroll up, we can see that it renders 28. Now, if we look and we see our new components that we defined in this file, we have a sum component, takes A and B, adds them together. A difference component, A minus B. And then a product, which multiplies them together. Now in every single case, it's just simple helper components up top that adds the two numbers together, no type definitions. Now if we take a look at the right, when we did this, we had to define an interface here, which we then passed to our generic in the case of FC. But we also have the option where we cannot use that interface. So in the first two, sum and difference, we used the interface math props. But down below in our product, we actually defined it in line. Okay, we defined it in line. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the simpler example. It might make more sense. Okay, so in this case, we said the sum component takes in props with the values A and B. The type of the props is math props, right? Math props says A is a number and B is a number. The sum and difference both use that interface. However, if we scroll down to the product component, we could have also chose as a developer to do an inline definition. So the product takes A and B, but instead of defining a type up above, I just defined A and B as being an object with two numbers in it, inline. And again, this is something that you might see in the wild. You might see interfaces and you might see inline, and depending on the developer and the project, it will differ. So you have to become familiar with seeing how things can be typed differently in TypeScript, specifically in this case when you're writing React components. Now let's scroll back up to the top again and let's take a look at our character differences. So we have 48 lines in this file and we have 42 lines in this file. We have 472 lines versus 614 lines. So not that big of a deal for this first file. There's not much more going on, okay? But if we scroll down and we take it our final iteration of our user component, that's what this file is, you can see that in order to show a user component that shows a first name, last name, date of birth, a count with a counter and an add button to increment it, something to get rendered, and if we're using TypeScript or JavaScript, with all the features that we discussed, we can see that it took us 53 lines of JavaScript and 857 characters. If you scroll down, it's very quick to read this code, right? We can just see we have a data table data, an add one function, and a user component. We have an incrementer, and then we have our JSX. Pretty straightforward. Now, if we scroll over to the right and we take a look at our TypeScript, well, first we see this table data props, then we see our table data component, then we see our add one. Then we see a whole bunch of stuff about our button props and our user props. And finally, we get down to our user component where we have all of our properties. We say that it takes user props, and then we render our JSX with our useState hook and our incrementer. So not a huge deal, right? But you can think about how over time, when you write more complex React sites, that when you use TypeScript, there will be more cognitive load in terms of viewing a file because there's just more to look at. Now, people will argue that it's actually less cognitive load because A, you could actually split these out into more files, make it simpler, simplify the code a little bit. And because you get that IntelliSense, it becomes very clear when I, for example, need to render a button or pass a button to this user object, in this case, this blue button, I know that that object I am going to pass to user needs to have an on-click handler, right? And optionally can have a color and a disable. If I'm writing that code in JavaScript, it's not necessarily as clear as if I wrote it in TypeScript, and it might catch some bugs. Now, that being said, a lot of IDEs are getting a lot better and a lot smarter, such that it might know that the user object can take a button, and that the button object can take those properties without even using TypeScript. So that's something that is cool that you can get. IDEs can get pretty smart with things. But again, the purpose of this video was to show you guys how in React you write something in JavaScript versus writing it in TypeScript, and how you might see different versions of that TypeScript in the wild. And again, this is just 2 different versions. I only have shown some of the different ways to type things in React. You will see potentially other ways, and you need to make sure that you're familiar with old syntax versus new syntax, and you've become familiar with things like React Element, JSX Element, React Node, the functional component, amongst other things as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope that you learned something here. And if you want to play around with this example to use it as an educational guide to help you get started with JavaScript in React and TypeScript in React, I will link the deployed version of this in the description in the video. And with that, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.